Welcome to Season 5 of AIHA's podcast series, The Healthier Workplaces Show, where we explore timely and informative topics about occupational and environmental health and safety. I'm your host, Alejandro Castillo. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with investigative journalist Georgia G. Georgia is currently a researcher at the New York Times. Over the last 5 years, she has been based in New York and East Africa, working on projects across print, digital, podcast, and documentaries. As a freelancer, her work appeared in Foreign Policy, The Intercept, Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, and Wired. She has been the recipient of grants from the Pulitzer Center and the Fund for Investigative Journalism. Georgia is the speaker for the Upton Sinclair Memorial Lecture titled The Trash School at this year's AIHA Connect 2026. The Upton Sinclair Memorial Lecture is an annual lecture that highlights the importance of media in OHS. Georgia spent a year investigating this horrific story of environmental racism and public health neglect. The lead was buried deep. She searched through thousands of documents, archival newspapers, and traveled to East Gainesville, Florida, to uncover how an elementary school sat on a toxic waste site and how officials knew and never cleaned it up. In today's episode, we will discuss how she came across this story, the reporting process and challenges, including pushback from state agencies, and how in the U.S. this toxic site is not uncommon. Georgia, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's get started. Can you tell me a little bit more about your journey into investigative journalism and what drew you to the story in East Gainesville, Florida?
Sure. Yeah. My journey, I'm kind of one of those people that always wanted to be a journalist. So from a very young age, I knew that this is what I wanted to do. And I grew up in London and went to grad school in New York. And afterwards, was working in New York for various different organizations for different years. And at this point, when I found this story, I was a freelancer. And I found this story because during COVID, I had worked on a project filing public records requests across the country to investigate the COVID response by national and state governments. And we filed hundreds of requests. And as the years went by and I transitioned into different jobs and roles, I kind of forgot about the ones that never got answered. And a response came back to me in Florida a few years later. And I was like, you know what? Let me just take a look through. So I skimmed through hundreds of pages, a lot of them totally irrelevant. And in these emails, I came across one from a local nurse who was emailing health officials saying she was very concerned about the health of children and if it was related to environmental issues in East Gainesville. It was specifically around it being a pediatric asthma hotspot. So after I found the email, I tracked down the person that had sent it. She was called Ali. She was extremely confused why a reporter was calling her and how she had even seen her email. That's a little bit the freaky thing about FOIA. People don't always realize that you're reading their emails. And I spent a long time building a relationship with her, right? It's really strange when a journalist just calls you up and suddenly wants to know everything. And so there was very many months of conversation. She was like the reporter's dream because she is an amazing researcher in her own right. So she started pointing me to state databases where she had started compiling her own information at the time. So I was going through all of that while speaking to her, going through thousands of documents. And my process is usually building a timeline. So investigative journalism is about identifying, patterns and trends. And, I had to go and be on the ground. I had to talk to community members. I had to understand what the real impacts were. So yeah, I went for about a week and I spoke to many community members, identifying different trends, learning more about how they had really suffered, seeing that other side of town, which was mentioned in the story, which it's much whiter in demographic, and it's much more resourced, and it's very built up compared to the east side. So just seeing the material reality of how underfunded and under-resourced And seeing all of this was horrific, but also persuaded me more than ever that this was a story that needed attention.
Absolutely. Now, were there any gaps in the records that made the truth harder to uncover?
Completely. It's never straightforward. So the biggest thing was that I didn't even know that there was a landfill, which is the center of the story now, on the property in the 1950s until I went to Gainesville. And I went to the local library and I started searching around. And in the archive, I think it was like the local newspaper that no longer existed, was pointing to these crazy articles in the archive about this landfill in the 1950s. And it was like, I couldn't believe it. Like, I sat in the local
I know.
library in shock. And if you've read some of those quotes in the article, they are just absolutely obscene. And so then I was like, oh, okay, so this is where it all began. But then also there's another conflicting point in the article, which is about these underground oil tanks that were very common at the time. And so being able to correlate and make sense of this long timeline, many, many decades, and what came from what, when I was also being very stalled by local officials, and there wasn't any clear, nothing was clear in pointing me through the entire timeline. Um, that was difficult, and there were many gaps, and bridging those gaps honestly came down to having a really good editor and also, again, speaking to academics and researchers. And in a way, sometimes a story is stronger when you show what we don't know, because it shows an immense amount of neglect and calls for accountability. And so I think that's what the story did.
This is probably my favorite question, but what was the nail in the coffin moment when you found proof that officials knew about the danger? How did you react? What'd you do?
I definitely think it was sitting in that library, finding those articles of the city manager saying, it's a necessary evil. We've spent many hours on top of a landfill being happy. Reading those quotes, seeing those pictures was definitely like, wow, I really have a story here. And this is egregious. So yeah, that was, I think, the whoa moment.
Speaking about the state agencies, what kind of resistance did you run into and how did it play out?
Yeah, basically no one was willing to talk to me, which not surprising, that happens. I think though I was presenting them with so many decades of evidence that I was very surprised at the lack of engagement and the lack of answers from them. The school wasn't interested in talking. The city of Gainesville was like, we can't corroborate this. The county also, I was stalled kind of at all. The Florida Department of Health wasn't interested. So that was definitely disappointing. And the end process was waiting a long time for them to come back to me with comments. And then none of the comments really helped,
Yeah.
corroborate anything. So, yeah, they weren't really willing to answer my questions.
How widespread is the issue of schools being built on or even near landfill/contaminated sites?
Very is the
Wow.
answer. So, I mean, it's very much an issue of environmental racism and neglect. And, I saw this in East Gainesville. This was a predominantly Black area, very underfunded, very under-resourced. And the more I spoke to academics that, studied or worked in this kind of environmental justice, environmental racism space, it became more and more clear it was largely due to, racist housing laws. And this is not a trend in one place. This is a trend across the country. And so as part of this story, I did start chronicling other schools next to landfills that I was finding. I think the story mentions that we found a load in 35 different states, and
Wow.
teaser to come at some point because I need to get there. I was building a map of these and hoping to publish something bigger that speaks to the wider issue. So that's still something on my mind that I'm hoping to do.
Absolutely. You kind of answered my next question because I was going to say, if this story had a next chapter, what would you hope it includes? Is there any more you can add to that?
Well, yeah, I hope it includes that, and I hope I mean, the story briefly mentions this, but there is no federal law that speaks to school sightings. So
Mm.
there's EPA guidelines from 2011, which has like discretionary advice about where schools can sit or should sit, and but there's not one single federal law, and states have their own and laws, and they often also the state laws don't apply to existing schools. Um, so I think that I would really like to be able to build something bigger off this, just from finding this example. Yeah, I've become aware that there's many more, diving deep into other court cases, etc. So that's definitely something that's at this point been on my mind and my radar and in my work for many years.
Now, talking more about the OHS industry, how can investigative journalists and OHS professionals work together? What are the first steps to making sure change is happening?
Yeah, I think this is a great question and something that both sides should tap into way more. Right? You have the experts who, this is your job every single day. You guys are filled with the knowledge, with the expertise, with the awareness. Journalists are often diving into many different topics. And so we're not experts in one thing at all. And having more conversations, even if they're informal, even if they're on background, even if they're off the record of, you know, what is on your mind? Journalists asking experts, what have you been thinking about? What are you seeing coming up? Tell me what has been the focus of your work for the last few months. Um, these conversations can be so fruitful and really the starting point for stories. And I don't think that we do this enough. I like to tell this to journalists starting out a lot, like call up academics. Like they want to talk about what they do.
Mhm.
And that's an amazing undertapped resource for us. And I feel the same way here, where experts are sitting on fountains of knowledge, and it only takes one conversation for a journalist to be like, oh, there's a story there, like that's a lead, that's something that I could dive into. So being open to those conversations is something that, yeah, I should do more, and I think that all journalists should do more too.
You're never a stranger when you're in New Orleans. Our hospitality roots run deep here. That's one of the many reasons why New Orleans is built to host. Hi, I'm Walt Leger, President and CEO of New Orleans & Company. We're honored to welcome AIHA Connect, the conference and expo for OEHS professionals, to New Orleans. Our city is proud to host your community of leaders and practitioners in occupational and environmental health as you come together to collaborate and develop the industry. From energizing educational sessions to meaningful networking and a dynamic expo, AIHA Connect drives progress that protects workers and communities. From all of us here in New Orleans, welcome to AIHA Connect 2026. We can't wait to help make your conference inspiring, impactful, and unforgettable. During your stay, immerse yourself in the culture of the Crescent City. Our authenticity is guaranteed to ignite inspiration, both within your meeting spaces and while you explore our unique places, most of which are just a short walk away. All around you, rich history converges with the future. Here, our soul-stirring traditions make way for mind-blowing innovations, and every interaction provides a vibrant opportunity to connect, collaborate, and create. When you aren't talking business, chances are you'll be talking about what's for dinner. And with so many world-class restaurants on the menu, you're guaranteed to want to come back for seconds. Unforgettable experiences are inevitable when you gather in New Orleans, and there's always space at our table. So pull up a chair, because everyone's welcome here. New Orleans, we're built to host.
Now, you're going to be attending AIHA Connect 2026. You're presenting the Upton Sinclair Memorial Lecture titled The Trash School. What would you tell somebody who is interested in joining this session and hearing more about it?
Yeah, well, this was, I guess, a good sneak preview. But yeah, I'm excited to talk about and break down the reporting process. I think a lot of people have don't have really an idea of how much goes on behind the scenes in reporting just one article. And this was like an entire year of my life, so breaking down how I found this, showing how we could be using state databases more, talking about how to, build trust with sources, I hope kind of opens up the audience to this relationship I'm talking about where, it's fruitful for both sides for us to investigate and, come up with more ways that we can bring awareness to different issues. So I hope that the lecture is a good starting point for that, and a starting point for, experts who are coming to the conference to think about, wow, this is how I could share my research, or this is a way that a journalist could dive in deeper to something that we're not talking about enough.
Georgia, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
That wraps up today's episode of the AIHA's Healthier Workplaces show. To learn more, visit the AIHA website and follow us on social media. Thank you for tuning in, and as always, remember that healthier workplaces mean a healthier world. Until next time.